We've all got our favourite shows from childhood, whether they made us laugh, or sing, or cry, but one show's significance goes beyond just entertainment. In one of the most ambitious experiments of its time, this programme challenged traditional kids media, and in the process, found its spot as the longest running children's TV show. But what many may not realise is this show started life as an ultra-effective early education initiative, improving grades for young children across America. The question is it possible for a television show to entertain and teach? And when measuring the impact of programmes like these, do we have the tools to reflect success accurately? Or is it too good to be true that one series creates educational benefits that outperform academic initiatives at cents on the dollar? In this video, I'd like to make the case that Sesame Street is the greatest education initiative of all time. In 1966, Joan Gans Cooney was an Emmy Award-winning documentary producer at New York television station WNET. At a dinner party with friends Lloyd Morissette, an executive at Carnegie, and her boss Louis Friedman, the topic of television to educate children was discussed. A week later, the trio were at Morissette's office, where the Carnegie Corporation agreed to fund Joan to formally investigate this subject. The following year, Cooney was travelling the US and Canada conducting interviews with experts in education, television and child development, asking the question, could television teach preschoolers?
I know because, as I said in the study, they're singing commercials all over the country. Why can't you teach them something else? And I suggested in the report a show something like Sesame Street be created.
As a result of the investigation, Cooney produced The Potential Uses of Television in Preschool Education. Despite her credentials and the in-depth report, the proposal to make a TV show was rejected by WNET. Not to be deterred, Cooney and Morissette spent the next few years raising $8 million in funding from people such as Carnegie, the US Office of Education, and the Public Broadcasting Corporation. That's about $72 million in today's money. In 1968, the Children's Television Workshop was born, with Cooney in charge, and work began on Sesame Street. So what would happen if you created a TV show the same way you design experiments? You'd have a theory, you'd test that theory, and if you got it wrong, you would tweak, you'd correct accordingly. When the show was publicly announced in 1969, Cooney set out the proposal. Sesame Street would teach kids the alphabet, numbers, geometry, and reasoning skills through skits and cartoons. To give you some important context, education for young kids wasn't the same as it was today. Most 3-year-olds didn't go to kindergarten or nursery, and it was pretty similar for 4-year-olds. If you were lucky enough as a 5-year-old to go to kindergarten, chances are you weren't there all day. That meant Cooney's experiment was a pretty big challenge. Sesame Street wasn't just reinforcing school learning, it was the foundation for it. To make the experiment work, Cooney would need to assemble a dream team. John Stone, who led the writing of the show and casting, Gerald Lesser, who designed the educational objectives, Jim Henson, famous for the Muppets, who accepted the offer because he thought the programme would only last a few months, and Edward Palmer make up a handful of the staff involved in making the show. Joan Gans Cooney said herself, "From the beginning, we, the planners of the project, designed the show as an experimental research project with educational advisors, researchers and television producers collaborating as equal partners." At the heart of the show was research and experimentation. Sesame Street was the first show to have curriculum goals and educational targets. To make sure it was both educational and engaging, everything and everyone went through the experimental funnel. Stone hired the cast whose auditions got the best response from focus groups. After children paid attention more in Muppet scenes, Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch were added to interact with actors. What's more, children were most engaged when they saw other children on screen. So they brought in more kids to be part of improvised skits with the puppets.
A, B, C, D, E, F, to Cookie Monster.
Just because something is different doesn't mean it's better. So did it work? There were 2 success criteria for Sesame Street. 1. Be popular enough to warrant the large initial investment. 2. Improve preschool kids' learning and outcomes. After its premiere, Sesame Street's initial ratings were under 2 million. For a show of this magnitude, that's not a lot. However, CTW reported that 25% of all preschoolers were watching. Despite the uncertain start, the show was well received. Cooney, alongside the show itself, received glowing praise from newspapers, magazines, and the wider press. Year after year, Sesame Street grew. Clearly, the focus on experimentation and getting experts on board was paying off. The show was big, but after all, that wasn't really the point. Was it educational? CTW commissioned the Educational Testing Service, ETS, which dates back to the 40s, to measure the programme's educational impact on preschoolers, which led to this 1970 report. In this study, ETS assessed preschoolers before the release of Sesame Street, getting their baseline answers to a series of questions on capital cities, body parts, and counting. After the 26-week season, those same kids were brought back and tested again. This time, their scores grouped based on how much they watched Sesame Street. What ETS found was children who watched most frequently learned the most, and this held true across age, sex, geographical location, socio-economic status, mental age, and viewing location. Now, if you're anything like me, you might have a few questions. Are there other factors that could influence the gain in scoring? Could it be perhaps households who could afford a TV afforded other privileges that improved scoring? Or perhaps parents that encouraged children to watch Sesame Street, maybe they knew the value of education. On top of all of this, why is it that splitting kids into groups based on how much they watched led to an unequal average of pre-test scoring? It seems clear to me that other factors were at play, which means this report isn't credible. Fortunately, the success and impact of Sesame Street wasn't determined by one study. And at time of recording, there have been over 1,000 papers, books, and studies done since the somewhat less than credible 70s paper. As it turns out, Sesame Street was almost too successful to study with a control group. Everyone was watching, or at least trying to. By 1979, 9 million kids watched every day, and CTW, who are now called Sesame Workshop, became self-sufficient thanks to merchandising and licensing agreements. As it turns out, a great place to look for the educational impact of Sesame Street is in a recent report analysing historical data, which the Washington Post called the most authoritative study ever done on the impact of Sesame Street.
The people in your neighborhood, in your neighborhood, in your neighborhood.
Wellesley professor Philip B. Levine and University of Maryland economist Melissa Kearney challenged the initial research and came up with their own study, which theorised that if Sesame Street really did give kids an advantage, urban areas where the broadcast signal was weakest, like Washington DC or Southern California, wouldn't have as large an increase in early childhood grade for age scoring compared to similar urban areas where the signal was stronger, like New York. Okay, history lesson. What you need to know is that in the late 60s and early 70s, cable TV wasn't really a thing. Needless to say, internet streaming wasn't either. Because of how the show was transmitted, you have kids who live in similar places with the same social economic groups, except one group has strong access to Sesame Street and one weaker. What the authors theorise is that after 1969, Sesame Street's release, you would see an increase in grade for age average, but there would be a delta between areas that had weak access to Sesame Street and those with a strong broadcast. This graph shows the expected preschool start year for kids alongside the deviation of average test scores. Remember, these counties are otherwise comparable, and as the report goes into further detail, this feels like a good A/B test. The report goes on to say, as a whole, those in strong reception counties are 1.5 to 2 percentage points more likely to be at the grade level appropriate for their age in 1980, which is some 10 years after they might have started watching Sesame Street. Overall, this figure provides evidence supportive of an effect on grade for age status brought about by exposure to Sesame Street. Now you might say that a 2 percentage point increase isn't a lot, so what does that mean in the context of early education? Project Head Start was a summer program started in the 1960s that aimed to break the cycle of poverty by giving kids education, nutritional, healthcare and social support. One aspect of the program was its positive impact on academic performance. However, it cost much more than Sesame Street per kid, which led the Nixon administration quoting, "We can get Sesame Street to poor kids for 65 cents. Why should we spend over $1,000 on Head Start?" The aforementioned study investigated the effects of Sesame Street compared to something like Head Start and clarified. The results suggest that the introduction of Sesame Street for white and black non-Hispanic children had similar effects on elementary school performance as did participation in the Head Start program. Of course, it would be fair to say that academic performance isn't the only point of programs like Head Start, but it did begin the conversation comparing programs like Perry Preschool, which cost on average $4,800 at the time per kid, against decentralised initiatives like Sesame Street, that seem to be, pound for pound, better value when you compare academic performance. That raises the question, if we are to accept that Sesame Street is the greatest educational initiative of all time, do we measure success based only on the direct impact of the show? Sesame Street is one of the longest running TV shows in the world. With over 222 Emmys and 11 Grammys, it's hard to escape the feeling that it is one of, if not the, biggest show in the world.
All across America. Sesame Street has begun a 2-year initiative to teach young kids about math and science.
In 2019, 190 million children viewed over 160 versions of Sesame Street in 70 languages. Sesame Workshop is the largest informal educator of young children in the world. Alongside their media, Sesame Workshop run their own initiatives tackling difficult issues like HIV, conflict, and racism for children in all corners of the globe. But it would be naive to suggest that the impact the show has had on childhood education was due solely to what they created. The success, recognition, and scrutiny of the show lit the touch paper on the crossover between education and media. In 2007, the educational research nonprofit the Joan Ganz Cooney Center was founded. By focusing on research, policy change, and technological advancements, the center studies the role of digital tech in promoting education for children. From national STEM video game competitions to university collaborations, this institute is at the forefront of how digital media can not only be entertaining, but perhaps more importantly, educational. When an audience, especially a young audience, is given the choice of fun or learning, we're putting many at a disadvantage. It's our duty as educators and content creators to bring those two together in a way that delivers meaningful impact at scale. I hope we'll see more successful games, shows, and films incorporating educational aspects, because it's possible to do that without making them boring. And if we can get that right, I wonder how much of an impact that'll have on the next generation.